Based on the kinds of games I've covered on the show so far, it's probably pretty easy to tell that I'm a huge fan of horror games and turn-based RPGs. So when I decided to check out yet another early PlayStation game, I figured it only made sense for me to check out Parasite Eve, a game that is trying to be both of those things. Parasite Eve came out in 1998 and was an attempt at merging together the turn-based combat that Squaresoft was known for at the time with the horror elements of the Biohazard games. This game was a first for Squaresoft in a few different ways. First being that it was their first game to get a mature rating here in the States, and then it was also Square's first, and as far as I could tell last, game to be based on a book. Yeah, Parasite Eve is actually based on a book of the same name that was written by Hideki Senna, who actually helped the director and writer of the game Takahashi Tokita, who was also the director and writer on other extremely important Squaresoft games like Live a Live and Chrono Trigger, write the story for this game. Despite that, Parasite Eve isn't a direct recreation of the book, however. Far from it, actually. It's an entirely original sequel to the book. I'll go into that a bit more in a bit, but it is a fascinating situation to me since you don't hear about a lot of books getting direct sequels in the form of a game, except for like the Thing game, which kind of ruins the point of the movie, and I just realized as I'm saying this, that's not a book, that's a movie. I'm going to keep that in, I think that was funny. Anyway, this game as a whole is fascinating since it was Squaresoft's attempt to jump on the survival horror craze that Biohazard / Resident Evil had popularized in that period, while keeping the style of gameplay that they already had a deep understanding of. Does this unique genre crossing end up working? Well, why don't we find out? As always, there will be spoilers, so if you really care about going in blind, I'd recommend clicking off the video until you finish the game, or just jumping ahead to the part of the video where I talk about other aspects. I'll have those tagged in the description down below, but either way, why don't you just sit back and get comfortable. I'm Jay, and let's talk about Parasite Eve. Diving right into this recap, the game starts with our protagonist, Aya Bree, taking a night off from her job as a cop for the NYPD on Christmas Eve to go to the opera with her new boyfriend. This date is almost immediately ruined, however, by the lead actress causing the entire opera house except for Aya to burst into flames. Aya goes up to confront the lead actress, Melissa, where she tells Aya her mitochondria aren't developed enough for her, and she leaves with Aya giving chase. She drops down through a hole in the stage into the backstage and corners Melissa, who mutates into a monster and proclaims her name is now Eve, before disappearing. You leave the theater and meet your partner from the NYPD, Dan. He gets you out of there, and then the next day begins. Aya embarrasses the chief at a press conference by being honest about the insane stuff she saw that night, followed by her and Dan going to the Museum of Natural History to find a Dr. Clamp, who Dan and Aya believe may have a connection to the situation due to his knowledge on mitochondria research. After the doctor acts like a pompous ass all over his office, Dan and Aya realize that Melissa was supposed to have a concert in Central Park that night, and that Dan's ex-wife and his son were supposed to be in attendance. The two of them rush to the park, and Dan's unable to enter due to the sheer force of Eve's power threatening to cause him to spontaneously combust if he gets any closer. So Aya goes in alone, finding Melissa / Eve on the stage of a packed theater, which she liquefies the entire population of moments later. Aya chases after Eve and ends up fighting her on a horse-drawn carriage from hell before it crashes, causing Aya to pass out. Meanwhile, Dan finds his son, who ran from the concert early because he was feeling sick and his mom was acting strange, so he didn't feel safe. Dan learns shortly after this that all of Manhattan Island is being evacuated due to the threat Eve poses, and since, they can't ignore it anymore like they tried earlier. Aya wakes up the next day in the care of Dan and Maida, a Japanese scientist that managed to sneak into the city due to him trying to study the Eve phenomenon. He then tells Aya and Dan the origin of Eve, explaining that she came about when a scientist back in Japan tried to use mitochondria cell cultures to rebuild his wife's body after a car accident. But in the process, they became sentient and ended up taking over her body entirely and mutating. Maida then further explains that Eve may be trying to give birth to the ultimate being due to the fact that evolved mitochondria cannot thrive fully in a human body. Not too much time to dwell on this though, since the police station has been attacked by Eve and you gotta go save Dan's son. Aya fights off as many creatures as she can in the station before she has to battle a dog from the Thing to save Dan's son and the police chief. Except Aya only really manages to save the kid and the chief goes down. The next day, Aya, Dan, and Maida go to pay another visit to Dr. Clamp to try and learn more about Eve and what could possibly be done to stop her. Clamp isn't there though, so Maida compares Eve's blood to Aya's, and we learn that Aya's mitochondria are also evolving, but in a different way from how Eve's is. Clamp shows up immediately after, acts like an ass again, and kicks you all out. Aya and Maida then rush to the hospital to try and stop Eve, since they realize that if she's going to give birth to the ultimate creature, she's going to need... well, she needs to get sperm. Here you learn that Melissa was in an accident as a kid and got organ transplants from Aya's sister, who had advanced mitochondria like Aya does. Aya's sister died, but the mitochondria began to evolve within Melissa, eventually becoming Eve. After this, you try to destroy the semen freezers, but Eve already managed to get some before Aya got out. She drops a military-grade plane on Aya and escapes while Aya narrowly avoids getting blown up by the plane crashing into the building. The next day, everyone left at the NYPD is on high alert trying to find Eve. Aya manages to find the sludge of people that died in Central Park have congealed into a brainless gas mass that's trying to poison the water supply. Aya flushes them into the already polluted rivers and then finds out Eve has taken refuge at the museum. Aya goes there, finds out Clamp made genetically altered super sperm to support the birth of an ultimate being, and then as soon as he finishes explaining this, he explodes. Aya then fights the dead person Jello that has taken the form of a T-Rex before confronting Eve, who manages to survive an attack due to the liquid people protecting her. She then leaves the museum and the military grabs Aya, Dan, and Maida and then begs Aya to take care of Eve because she's the only one who can get close enough without burning to death. Aya fights Eve until she succumbs to her cells, dying on the wreckage of the Statue of Liberty. Aya is brought back to the ship and everything is cool and fine until the ultimate being is born anyway. Aya fights it and manages to kill it due to the special bullets given to her by Maida, and then you run away due to it not actually being dead. Aya then blows up the ship, hopefully killing it for good this time. The game ends on Aya's mitochondria taking over everyone in the same opera house that the game started in. Kinda. See, if you play the game over again on EX mode, you get the option for an alternate ending, where you go to the Chrysler building and meet your dead sister, who explains Eve made a nest in the building as a backup if the ultimate being plan failed. You and your sister fight the purebred ultimate being, you win, but Aya and Maya's cells start getting taken over by Eve until Maya manages to push through it, saving Aya in the process. Aya then leaves, having deepened her connection with the spirit of her sister. Okay, so I'm going to be upfront. That story is absolutely wild in a way I wasn't expected going into this game. It has a lot of extremely interesting elements to it, even if the finer details were kinda odd, to say the least. I honestly kinda want to read the book now after having played through this. That being said, while the plot was solid, I didn't really feel the characters in this game. Aya doesn't do a lot character-wise throughout the plot. It felt like she's kind of there for a lot of it, unfortunately, and I wish we got more of a chance for her to be characterized. She just kind of felt like she was extremely reactive to everything going on and didn't really have many defining traits shown throughout other than badass and likes opera. Dan has a bit more going on, but that's mainly just because of the father angle. Clamp is just a standard evil mad scientist, and Maida's two traits are scientist and spiritual. That being said, even though I do wish they were fleshed out a bit more, I did like them as characters and they worked well within the plot. They just weren't super fleshed out. And then there's Clamp, who I didn't like anyway. They just kind of were there to move the plot along and didn't really do much other than just be kind of a dick to you. The main aspect I don't like, though, is the whole situation with the true ending. I'm not really a fan of them tying the true ending of the game to an entire second playthrough, with the only changes being having your gear from the last run and the final area. Feels kind of strange and like it actively takes away from the narrative of your game to me. I didn't end up playing through the game again just for the ending, so I'm just going to use this footage I have here of the hospital. But honestly, for the changes it makes, it doesn't feel worth it to do the entire second playthrough just to get that for me. Feels like a better ending to me than the Evil Eyes of the Opera did, but not enough of a better ending for me to play through the game a second time just to see it. It's not like Biohazard 2 where you have two different stories in the same location, it's just the exact same thing over again. Overall, the story for this game is pretty interesting once everything is all said and done. I just wish it was handled a bit better with the alternate ending personally. It's a lot more out there than I was expecting going into this, but it was out there in an interesting way, I thought. I definitely think it's worth checking this game out just to see the insane twists and turns it goes through for yourself. Parasite Eve's take on turn-based combat in a horror setting is done really interestingly, in my opinion. Once you enter a battle, you're actually free to move around the battle area and try to avoid your enemy's attacks the best you can until your active time battle meter fills up. When the ATB meter is full, you can choose from a plethora of actions to take to turn the odds in your favor. Those are generally split up into a few key actions, such as shooting your weapon, using your parasite energy to use the game's magic equivalent, use a healing item, or switch out your weapons. If you use an attacking move, you also have to be within range of the target to have a chance for the best damage and hit rolls, and if the enemy moves out of range before you fire, it will affect your chance of landing a hit. I think this system is really interesting conceptually and is admittedly pretty fun to use at most points in the game, but it does have its fair share of flaws in my opinion, the biggest one of those being how the game handles weapons. Throughout the game you can find a multitude of different guns that you can use in your fight against the mutations. Unlike most survival horror games though, almost all of these guns all share ammo. You don't need to save your ammo for your shotgun and only use your pistol for a while like you do in stuff like Silent Hill because your ammo is shared between all weapons. The only exception to this is rockets, and I'm pretty sure that's just because the devs realized how broken it would be to give rockets the same ammo pool as everything else. I honestly don't really see the point in including an ammo system in this game if it's going to be like this, since it's not really treated like a resource. If you play the game without scouring the map for every little item, you'll still end up with more bullets than you'll ever really need, and since they don't have different counts between guns, you don't ever really need to worry about having the right kind on you. It's a system that feels like it was kind of lifted directly from survival horror games without really understanding why it's there, and then being changed in a way that makes it not really work. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it just feels kind of pointless with how it's been implemented, though I think the reasoning behind this this may be tied to how the inventory system in this game works. The game's inventory has a limited number of slots like most survival horror games, but what's interesting is that as you level up, the inventory automatically expands with each level you gain. I think the ammo was consolidated into one uniform type just to take up less space in the inventory originally, but that stops being an issue as time goes on because your inventory just kind of balloons to basically not having a cap at all. I actually like this inventory system though. In most horror games that cap your items, by the time you reach the end game, you generally have a deep enough understanding of your inventory to where you don't really have to worry about your inventory, and this kind of gives the same feeling where by the end you just don't have to worry about what you have on you. I think this was also a necessary decision since there wasn't really a consistent item box system in this game. Generally when a game has a limited item system like in the early Biohazards or in Signalis, there will be item boxes throughout the game that allow you to store your items and pick them up whenever you reach a save point. That's not quite the case here since the only place you can drop off items is with Wayne in the armory, and he's not exactly around in 95% of the maps to switch out items with, so the bigger inventory feels pretty necessary to keep things going throughout the game. It also helps since outside of guns, ammo, and healing items, you tend to also end up having a lot of guns that you can use for scrap lying around. While the guns may all pull from the same ammo pool, they sure don't all feel the same, thankfully. Each gun is unique and has a different base set of attributes it can pull from, like rifles having only one shot that does high damage per reload but having high range, or pistols being able to fire 10 shots per reload but having only alright range and lower damage. You also get different attributes like freeze bullets or being able to act multiple times per action for some guns. These extra abilities don't have to stay unique to these guns though. A big part of the game is actually customizing your gun with parts from different guns. You can find tools throughout the game that let you disassemble a gun and take one of its stats or special abilities onto another one. If you do this though, the original gun you took from is destroyed in the process. That is unless you get a super tool, which keeps the gun intact but takes the part of it you want off. The system is honestly really cool. It feels like a really great way to customize your weapons and really decide how you want your main weapon to feel. You can also build separate weapons for separate situations since switching weapons is a part of the combat loop. It takes a turn to do, and while there were a few situations where it could have been helpful, I generally didn't bother since I spent the entire game just building up an assault rifle, until I found these pistols that let you take an extra action for free each turn, where I then transferred the important stuff from the gun to the pistols using super tools and normal tools. Having the bonus stats for an assault rifle and double attack pistols sure made for an easy end game, let me tell you. Oh, that reminds me, those extra stats can also be upgraded via random upgrade tokens you can find throughout the areas. They generally just upgrade your ammo capacity, your damage, or your range, but you can sometimes find different abilities that you can graft onto your gun. They don't affect stats too much, but they do add up over time, which is great in my opinion. It's kind of like the bonus XP system in a sense. To explain, when you level up, if you go over the amount of XP needed to level up your extra XP, it goes into a pool where you can choose certain attributes to level up. I was initially kind of unsure about this system because I felt weird for the XP to just not go towards the next level up, but I gotta say I do like this. It feels more personal and lets you choose for yourself how you want those points to go. The biggest point I can give this game is that it has an insane amount of customizing how you want to tackle its challenges. For the most part, it feels like it really wants the player to play with everything in the game and figure out the perfect way to play for them, and I really vibe with that. This unfortunately doesn't really transfer over to the magic system in the game though. As I mentioned earlier, Aya has access to her magic using her parasite energy. This magic can do various things such as healing her, curing poison, firing a Kamehameha, you get the idea. These spells can be used based off the amount of energy in your parasite meter. It's a pretty standard magic system overall. Where it gets kind of weird though is how the energy meter is constantly recharging both in and outside of battle. This feels a little weird in my opinion because when it's recharging you don't really have to think about how much you're using or really plan it out as much. There's still an element of planning there for when you run out or start using a ton of meter in the later game, but doesn't really feel like you're ever wanting for energy, which kind of feels like it removes a bit of the thoughtfulness behind using magic in other turn-based games to me. Granted, this isn't a Parasite Eve only problem, but it is one I felt was pretty prominent here. Overall, I like a lot of the ideas behind the systems Parasite Eve set in place, but I feel like there's room to grow here. A lot of the combat gameplay has great stuff in place theoretically that could be even better if they were tweaked to fit the tone of the game a bit more. I'll talk about this a bit more later, but it's kind of my biggest flaw with the gameplay overall. It's just that it doesn't match up tonally. That being said, what does end up matching really well tonally though is this game's soundtrack. When it comes to music, Parasite Eve's soundtrack tries to meld more atmospheric horror game music with the typical style of energetic track you'd find in most turn-based RPGs of that era in a way that worked out really well in my opinion. A lot of times the music would never feel outright tense, but would rather have these kind of haunting undertones to them while the more heavy industrial styled tones of the main track played. A good example of this would probably be the song Plosive Attack, which has an unnerving organ backing track being played behind the main intense battle music of clanging machines and synth instruments. It's actually the song I was playing earlier during a good chunk chunk of the gameplay section of this video. It's a really interesting blend of the two styles of music that is used for the two genres Parasite Eve is trying to mesh together, and I think it's really cool that it ended up working as well as it did for me. One little thing I did want to touch on that has no actual bearing on the music, but that I thought was funny, is that one of the main tracks in the game, Arise Within You, is a track I was surprised to hear when I was going through and listening to the music for this video again, because I thought it was the menu song from Armored Core. Not a criticism or anything, I just thought it was kind of a funny moment when I was going back and re-listening to stuff for this video. That being said, while I was looking into this, I actually learned that Yoko Shimomura was the composer for this game. I'm a big fan of her work on Kingdom Hearts and the Mario and Luigi RPGs, so it's cool to see her name pop up here when I dug into it a bit more. Overall, the soundtrack for this game was pretty impressive listening to it all again, and I honestly shouldn't be too shocked by that since out of everything the aesthetic it was going for is what this game managed to nail the hardest. I think the most impressive things about Parasite Eve are how they nail the visuals and overall tone needed for a horror game. A lot of set pieces and locations they pick work really well for horror, and a lot of them even make me feel like they came straight out of a Biohazard game, like the sewers or the subway tunnels section of the 5th day of the game. They really poured a lot of time into making this game look as good as they could, which is also what led to the game ending up on 2 discs due to their FMV cutscenes taking up too much space on the discs. This is probably one of my favorite facts about the game, and it was actually all I knew about the game going into it, other than, the genre. It's just a really funny thing about the game when all the full motion video cutscenes for it are less than 25 minutes long when all put back to back. The length of a normal half-hour TV episode was too much data for a PSX disc to handle. Meanwhile, now Sony's putting out multi-hour movies in every one of their PS5 games. Crazy how technology changes and advances like that. Back to the topic at hand though, I think this game really gets horror game aesthetics and has the style of them down in a way that's really surprising coming from a team that hadn't made a horror game before. Though the style fits perfectly, the actual gameplay of the game doesn't really connect well with its horror inspirations in my opinion. I touched on this a bit when talking about how the game works on a gameplay level, but I don't think the game balances its tone with its gameplay very well. When I first started the game, there was a tutorial that basically told me to keep a melee weapon on me at all times to conserve ammo. So right out the gate, I was under the assumption that there would be limited ammo throughout the game and that I would have to approach fights in ways that accounted for this. Having to pick when to use the precious ammo you have, when to try and just tough it through without wasting what may be important to an upcoming boss, playing as carefully as possible to conserve healing items for when they may really matter later. You get the picture. The game almost immediately goes in the other direction though, basically throwing weapons, ammo, and healing items at you like there's an infinite supply. This isn't inherently bad, and it makes the combat pretty fun. It just doesn't quite fit with a horror game. This game is more tinged in horror than outright a horror game in my opinion. There's a lot of things that are visually disturbing or creepy conceptually, but when you can just load your stack of 1,000 bullets into your super pistols or use your magic mitochondria powers to heal yourself infinitely mid-fight, it kind of removes the tension and sense of fear. I mentioned earlier that I think I'd like a lot of these systems a lot more if they were in another game, and I still stand by that. I think if the combat systems were in a game that wasn't trying to be a horror, they'd feel better since the sense of fear and self-preservation that is vital to survival horror games isn't needed there. As it is though, the combat system this game goes for just clashed with the tone the game tried to set, and it kind of took any sense of unease out of the game for me. If I had to compare this to anything, I'd say it's kind of like Biohazard 5 or Resident Evil 6 or Silent Hill Homecoming, though I still think the writing's much better in this game than in any of those games I just listed. The team that made this got the vibe down, but the way the game's actually played just doesn't meet with the story it's trying to do. It's probably one of the bigger examples of ludonarrative dissonance I've seen firsthand, honestly. For those of you that don't know, ludonarrative dissonance is when the story that's being told throughout the game doesn't match up with the story being told through the gameplay. Parasite Eve's story is about a lone cop with slowly budding psychic powers who's dealing with horrors beyond human comprehension and is struggling to try and keep the city from falling apart under this threat. There's a very real sense of horror here in the story and the environment as the world falls apart around Aya. Parasite Eve's gameplay, however, tells a story of someone who's a badass lone wolf who can just gun down hordes of genetic monsters with very little issue. A doesn't really struggle with the conventions of a normal survival horror situation like managing resources because the player never struggles. It's a shame too because I feel like they were so close to getting it right. The systems are all there just needs to be a few tweaks, and I think the gameplay would have been perfect for a horror turn-based RPG. But as it is, it just creates a weird, divided tone that I find difficult to get over personally. So now that we're wrapping up, where does that put Parasite Eve on the tier list? I'd say the game is solidly in B tier. It's a good game at its core in my opinion, it just has a few things that personally don't really work for me. I still definitely think that if you're a fan of turn-based RPGs or horror-themed games with an extremely unique story premise, I definitely recommend checking this out. Though I wouldn't recommend it if you're looking for something more survival horror than just horror flavored, if that makes sense. I mean, I hope it makes sense, that's kind of what the entire last section of this review was about. Honestly, I'm really curious to check out the sequel now. I'm excited to see what the team behind this game managed to pull off with a bit more experience for making a turn-based horror game. Anyway, we're 6 games down and things are starting to fill out a bit on this list. Hope you all are enjoying the tier list sections because I personally really like ranking / listing things because I'm a gigantic nerd, which is why I'm sticking with this format so far. I wonder when I'm going to actually get my first outright bad game though. Seems a little barren down there in D tier for now. And with that, that's all I really have to say about Parasite Eve. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Jay Talks About Games. I'm going to try to continue to upload new episodes of this every other Friday, so stay tuned for that if you'd like this episode. Beyond that, there's a few more things going up on this channel for my friends and I, which I'll have links to on screen and in the description down below. Be sure to check those out if you enjoyed this, since everything else we've working on is pretty great as well in my opinion. We also stream weekly over at Twitch, so be sure to check us out over there. And yeah, if you liked this video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, since as I'm sure you no doubt know from watching almost any YouTube video, that's the only way for YouTube's algorithm to notice smaller channels like this, and we would really appreciate the help. Regardless, I've been Jay, and thank you for listening to me. See y'all next time.